Hello, and thank you very much for coming along again this evening. This evening we're actually going to look at a problem which seems far away, but in fact is quite close to all of our circumstances, and one which we're going to be encountering more and more as the world's populations intrude upon one another with migration, climate change forcing much of that migration, but especially as we start to listen and think about radically different cultures from our own, ones that we haven't been used to, we haven't been engaged with, or at least we think we haven't. We have been engaged with them in ways we haven't been aware of, but it's going to come crashing home very quickly, and it's time now to think about mechanisms for, in a sense, regaining the linkage that we never knew we had. In fact, we do have a strong and long lineage of linkage between Africa and the rest of the world, but most of us don't know about it. We weren't taught about it in school, and it wasn't because they were conspiring to keep us ignorant, it's because they didn't know. There's a kind of conspiracy of ignorance around a lot of these issues, not by any ill will, but because we're ignorant of large portions of our own history. We're going to look today at the way in which cultures clashed very dramatically at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, and people had to make meaning out of very confusing circumstances. The ways in which they did that were extraordinarily inventive, and we can recapture some of that inventiveness, some of that creativity for what we're going to need to face from now on. So we're looking particularly at the question of grief, loss, and transcendence. Baule, blolo, bian, carvings, and the quest for personal meaning in the wake of collective defeat. Blolo, bian carvings are wooden carvings that are undertaken by sculptors on the command of women among the Baule tribe in the central Ivory Coast. We want to look a little bit at that because these are a very extraordinary kind of art that emerge in a very short period of time and have a very powerful message for us all. Art in general is something we should be drawn to look at in times of confusion and compressed social interaction. And art and transcendence in Africa is really a test case, in fact, the model case for the human enterprise at this point. Of all the world's great art, the body of work that contains some of the most recent and most dramatic example of the art of transcendence can be found in Africa. The essence of art is the depiction of the particular in the search of the general and the universal. Search for the general and the universal with the depiction of the particular. All humans respond to art. It's one of the definitions of being human. In fact, that's how we know the organisms are humans and not apes, when in their environment we start to see evidence of art. This is because art is by definition transcendent, and humans are self-transcendent. So that the art is the residue of their self-transcendence, their ability to look before and after and yearn for that which is not. All humans possess the capacity and the urge for transcendence, and we see examples of it. We know humans have been there. You can see this on the earliest of cave paintings, and the earliest of pottery, and the earliest of representation of any kind that we now regard as art. The reason for this is that humans make art, and art makes us human. It's a reciprocal process that got going several hundreds of thousands of years ago and is still operative. On the most fundamental level, in any culture and across all time, this is why humans recognize something to be art. It is something that transcends itself. We say something is art because it points to and evokes something beyond itself, particularly in the face of suffering or a shared sense of loss. That's crucial, suffering and loss. There is a special significance to colonial art in this respect, because the kinds of suffering and loss that occur on colonial frontiers is quite poignant. And it's why colonial art often speaks most directly to the modern world at this point. African colonial art is particularly powerful in this regard. In an important sense, of course, colonial art has long been part of African art. In its most general terms, colonial art is anything with a theme or motif in it that represents something from the history of European contact or colonial domination. It's present from the very earliest contacts of the Portuguese and the West African coast, where representations of Europeans are made in bronze plaques and carved, I shouldn't say carved, molded in bronze statues by existing populations in West Africa as they looked at the Portuguese coming in. The Benin left us with some of the most remarkable pieces of African art in this regard, and they're viewable down in New York City at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, as you can see, and here in Boston at the Museum of Fine Art. From the 16th century onward, there are representations of Europeans in African art. Even some of the most venerated pieces of classical African art sometimes contain elements of the colonial moment, you might call it, within them. Consider these ivories, for example. This ivory mask carved in West Africa is extraordinary, but if you look at it in detail, it's got an amazing amount of detail right up around the crown on the head, including mudfish on the one hand and Portuguese soldiers, the heads of Portuguese soldiers, depicted right next to mudfish, alternately represented as the crown of this particular African figure. In more recent years, other symbols of contact of cultures or novel technologies appear in all media of African art, from paintings to wood carvings and pottery, and even textiles. This kind of representation of a bicycle on the lid of a carved wooden piece is really quite characteristic of some of the art that's coming out of Nigeria, for example, in the last 100 years or so. In our day, colonial art from the recent past, by that I mean the last 150 years or so, deserves attention in helping us to understand the experience of transcendence, both in personal and collective terms, under circumstances that are really often very brutal and, in some cases, traumatic. Consider the substantial outpouring of wooden carvings of male figures among the Baule people in the Ivory Coast. They appear in various forms with white shorts, hands in pockets, sometimes very carefully carved facial figures and hair styles, indications sometimes of dress that's clearly not African dress, as in this case a veteran of World War I, an African troop force who had gone off to fight perhaps in Europe in World War I, and was carved upon his return almost as a portrait, with his cap and his hands in pockets and the like. More recently, in the 50s, we began to see Africans clothed with more modern dress, often in shorts, sometimes with soccer shoes on and the like, but in any case, containing some scarification of the face in some cases, and elaborate hairdos. In other cases, the shoes are with us, and we can watch the whole evolution, in a sense. Very interesting ringed neck here, indicating a certain amount of fat and prosperity, a symbol of prosperity in pre-colonial times. And others are carved with objects, like this one, who's sitting on a stool and has a gun, a very phallically placed gun, huge hands, and again the ribbed neck, very fine coiffure and the like. All of these are very significant components of the art, and art historians have looked into this in the past, particularly this fellow Philip Ravenhill, an anthropologist who studied the Baule and looked at, among other things, what the local meaning was of these carved figures in the pre-colonial period. He's written several pieces, one called The Self and the Other, and another catalog that was put out at the time that he exhibited some of this material at the National Museum of African Art, Dreaming the Other World, Figurative Art of the Baule, Côte d'Ivoire. He wrote another book called Dreams and Reverie, Images of the Otherworld Mates among the Baule. Now that's the key to understanding it. These are images of otherworldly spouses, as he puts it, otherworld mates. When they're female, they're images that men have asked to be carved. When they're male, they're images that women have asked to be carved. And therefore it's useful to identify this within the kinship structure of the Baule, and particularly the kinship problems that arise for anybody in what are called face-to-face societies, societies based on kinship relations rather than state or organizations based on the basis of conscription to various groups like military groups or civilian identities with occupations or anything like that. On kin-based societies, the relationship between different people is often diagrammed by triangles and circles by anthropologists. The triangles are male figures, the circles are female figures. Equal sign means marriage, descent sign means a line down, straight, and this kind of bracket of the inverted bottom of a box, or you can just consider it linkages, are between a woman and her brother. A woman here we'll call as the center of the tension is located in a nexus of relations between brothers, father, mother, husband, and I'm indicating here a son. Now, of course, she may have daughters as well, but I'm trying to highlight the fact, and for our understanding, we need to understand why it is that so many male figures show up among the Baule carved in the colonial style. Well, as it turns out, if we look closely at the relationships of the woman, two other male figures, it's quite interesting to look at. This atom of kinship was an idea of Lévi-Strauss years ago, and suggested that we could understand a lot by understanding the relationship of women to men as it is mapped through various kinship systems. And as you can see here, any Baule adult woman is related to a father, potentially, not always, but potentially to a brother, potentially but not always to a husband, and through that then to a son. So there may be at least four male figures that are related either by descent or consanguinity or marriage, as they call it, descent or marriage. And in that way, a woman has relationships, different kinds of relationships, but links, shall we call them, to four key categories of men in her environment. What's fascinating about the otherworldly spouses, though, images of otherworldly mates among the Baule, is that when you start looking at the fact that many of these otherworldly mates are men, therefore commissioned by women, you have to recognize that there's something interesting going on here. And it has to do with the way the atom of kinship works out among Baule women. Many of them, in adulthood, will take on what they call blolo bian, that is, otherworldly spouses, an otherworldly husband. And in some sense, he fits into this kinship structure in an equivalent way, but a very powerful and, in a sense, elusive way. Elusive in the sense that no one else can see this otherworldly husband, but this woman does. The spirit husband, or otherworld husband, is something that she envisions. She commissions a statue to be made in his image, and she tells the other men in her life what this otherworldly husband is telling her to do, telling her not to do, telling her about them, and the like. Now you can see this is a powerful figure in the imagination of this woman, but also in the existence of the other men in her life. If, for example, her husband is being a jerk and acting out of all proportion to things, she can start mentioning to him that the otherworldly husband is not very happy. Well, you can see that that might have an influence on the way this worldly husband would behave. Well, it's particularly important that these statuettes emerge in a period of French colonial conquest of this region. Conquest, but not full domination. This is the interesting part of it. Some of the groups within the Baule put up a resistance, others collaborate. But in any case, the collaboration and the resistance is based on very asymmetrical power. You can see some of the Baule warriors here have flintlock rifles from the age of the slave trade, and they're taking on the French machine guns. They may in fact be well established and dignified notables in their own right, but in military terms they're not going to do very well against this kind of asymmetry of power. They can carve all the guns they want to out of wood, but they don't work as effectively as real guns. And their flintlocks from the slave trade period can be loaded, muzzle-loaded, but they need powder. They do invent some powder that's very interesting in historical terms, but they have to be muzzle-loaded one at a time, and they don't do very well against repeating rifles, which the Europeans show up with plenty of. The Europeans have enormous stocks of military might, and they use it. Moving out of different administrative centers like this one in Bouake in the Central Ivory Coast, commanders like this start taking on the conquest of these people with the help of the Senegalese troops who are brought in are armed to fight for the French. Here we see le chef de bataillon, Nogues, that's his name, le commandant, who is, we are told on this postcard, in the central Ivory Coast, pacifying the Baule. And then things get a little more complicated. The French officers frequently take African wives and have children by them. Now, that introduces a very interesting component to the otherworldly spouse equations, especially when it gets brutal. The French are not very good at pacifying this people, this group of different peoples, I should say. As I say, some of them resisted, some of them collaborated, and the resistance wars went on for 20 years, in excess of 20 years, until the French started adopting some rather brutal techniques, which included starvation warfare and the ripping up of local crops through the rainy season and the dry season following it, leaving the populations very emaciated and having to move. The Baule were then placed in various villages, which were called liberated villages, as part of this pacification. And those that didn't starve to death were basically brought into submission by the Senegalese troops, brought down from Senegal. And you can see that this then becomes part of the equation. How do women function, make any meaning out of the loss and tragedy that they're facing collectively? Their husbands, their brothers, their fathers, their sons may well have been killed, and rather brutally so. But their only recourse, in many respects, is to navigate through the other males in their environment with things like the otherworldly spouse. This gives us a new dimension of grief and loss and transcendence, because the belief in the blolo bian, the otherworldly husband, is represented in these carvings, and it's part of a quest for personal meaning in the wake of collective defeat. The French eventually defeat the Baule, but that doesn't end the mystery, the anxiety, the doubt, and the affirmation of meaning. As Santayana observed at one point, each religion, by help of more or less myth, which it takes more or less seriously, proposes some method of fortifying the human soul and enabling it to make its peace with its destiny. Baule women had to make their peace with their destiny as the roles of the men around them changed radically and brutally in a very short period of time. It's perhaps no wonder that the carvings of otherworldly spouses become very, very numerous and quite detailed as we get representations of otherworldly spouses commissioned by Baule women. It's going to be an interesting road to try to, in effect, translate some of these features, because we need to learn how to do that in the world at large. We're all, in some sense, colonizers in an unfamiliar world. We're colonizing the world as a species without much understanding of how we've gotten there or what it is that we think we dominate. We only get one chance, and dominance in an ecosystem is a non-starter.